big wars and small gestures. These are the Americans who witnessed history. These are the wars as seen through their eyes. These are the stories of veterans from World War I, World War II, and the Korean, Vietnam, and Persian Gulf Wars. Each day, we lose 1,500 of those who served, and we lose more of our history as their stories go untold.
Recording those stories is a part of America's history. The entire story will come together when you tell your part of it.
Millions of Americans. Millions of stories. Tell your story. Ask others theirs. There's no story or sacrifice too small.
I urge all Americans, veterans and non-veterans alike, to participate in this very, very important project. Veterans help to shape our nation's future. And only by understanding what they did for us can we truly understand the price of freedom.
Hello, my name is Frank Boring. I am the Director of Oral History at the Michigan Military Preservation Society. We are a nonprofit organization that's building the Michigan Military Air, Land, and Sea Museum at the Gerald R. Ford International Airport. What you've just seen is an excerpt from a promotional film that was put out by the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. The Library of Congress Veterans History Project is an attempt to gather material, oral histories, documents, diaries, letters from all over the country of our veterans. Here at the Michigan Military Museum, we are a partner archive with the Library of Congress. What this means is that all the materials that we gather stay here in Michigan. We identify them, we put them into a database, and we will make them available to future generations to access through our website. What you're about to see is a raw, uncut oral history interview. At some later date, we will actually edit these and make them available through the schools. At this point, you will have an opportunity to see what it's like to have an actual oral history interview. These will be going on each week with a different veteran. We hope you enjoy. Al, let's begin with where were you born and when?
I was born in Lowell, Michigan on October 24th, 1920.
What's your early schooling like?
Well, I went through grade school and through high school at Lowell. Graduated in 1938 from Lowell High School.
Okay. What were your parents? What did they do?
My father worked in a small factory in Lowell and for 43 years, and so that was our home for all the time I was growing up and later on.
Mm-hmm. Did you have brothers and sisters?
I have one brother and two sisters.
Oh, that's great. Was this is a farm type environment that you lived in, or?
I was born into that environment, but after I was real young, in probably grade school, my folks moved into Lowell, and from then on it was more of a small town environment.
Mm-hmm. As you got through high school and after high school, event happened that was traumatic to the entire country. That was the attack on Pearl Harbor. I was just wondering, where were you and what happened? What was your reaction when you heard about that?
I was working or studying in an aircraft school in Wichita, Kansas during that period, and on December 7th of 41, Sunday afternoon, I was out in Wichita listening to the car radio, and I heard that devastating news.
What was your reaction?
I was just awestruck and disappointed, almost discouraged that as a young person I would likely be involved in the near future in a war.
Yeah. How old were you?
At that time I would have been 20 years old, 21.
All right. So what did you do? You finished up with the work that you did, and then? Within
2 weeks, I was working in Detroit in an aircraft plant that was making sub-assemblies for A-20 bombers. Okay. And I worked there for just 3 or 4 months, and I enlisted in the old Army Air Corps.
Right. Yeah, some people may not know that we didn't have an Air Force at that time. It was Army Air Corps, Navy Air Corps,
Yes.
Marine Air Corps. Just out of curiosity, why Army Air Corps? Did you have a choice? I mean, was there options for you?
I desired that. I'd had just a little taste of flying. I had been in some small planes on several occasions, and it was exciting that maybe I could get into the Air Force and at least be in the Air Force and possibly fly.
Okay. So once you enlisted, you went into the cadet program.
I went through the cadet program and was sworn in at Tiger Stadium on July 4th, 1942. And I was not called up then to be in active duty until February 12th of 43.
Okay. What was the next step after cadet training?
Well, I was sent to Nashville, Tennessee for classification. A week or so later, I was in Santa Ana, California in pre-flight school. From there, I went for 8 weeks to primary training at Tucson, Arizona. That was a civilian air training base. 2 months more in Pecos, Texas, where we began flying military training planes.
Okay.
VT-13, BT-13s.
Okay. You had mentioned earlier about classification. What does that mean?
Well, classification was a program or a designation as to whether you were qualified to be a navigator, perhaps because of mathematics or because of whatever. And some men went into being gunners, some bombardiers, and I was interested in learning to fly.
Okay. So each stage then was specifically designed to get you from this kind of training to that kind of training, and eventually you're moving along, so to speak, in your training as a pilot.
Yes. By the fall of 1943, I was in training in multi-engine aircraft at the air base in just outside of Phoenix.
Phoenix. You said multi-engine. What were the choices in terms of aircraft you could fly?
The choices that we were offered, and that wasn't necessarily ensured that you were going to be that.
Sure.
But I applied for twin-engine training. What they called multi-training was usually 4-engine, but I was interested in either flying something like a P-38 or a B-25.
Okay. And a P-38 was a single engine?
No, that's twin-engine fighter plane, twin boom, and a rather unique airplane, and it would have been my choice, and I was fortunate enough to get that choice.
Right. Some of these questions may seem like I'm stupid, but I want people to know what a P-38 is because they may not know. Not necessarily that I would know myself, but at any rate. So you ended up, as I understand it, flying the P-38s, and then you went to Santa Rosa in California.
Yes.
With the P-39s.
The P-39s were basically a training plane that were phasing out as a combat plane. And we did fly P-39s for about 6 weeks. Just to get cross-country flights and navigation and so on. Shortly after that, I had the privilege of flying some brand new P-63s, which were also a Bell aircraft plane. But from there, in the early 1944, our outfit was transferred to P-38s at Santa Maria.
Now, let's get an idea of your outfit. What are we talking about in terms of numbers of men training?
There were in the range of 50 to 60 in the class after we had graduated.
Okay.
And basically the thrust was to get us into fighter planes, which would be either escort or dive bombing or strafing.
Okay. Now, were these guys from all over the country?
All over the country, California to New York.
Okay. Where did you stay? At barracks or?
Stayed in regular barracks, and approximately half the time was in classrooms, and the other half was on the flight line or in the air.
Well, the thing that's fascinating is that, most of these guys had never been outside of their own home state or even their own hometown, so to speak. Suddenly you're in the barracks together. Give us an idea of what that was like in terms of...
I would say it was educational.
Okay.
I learned probably more at that point in time about other areas of the country, even cultures.
Yeah.
I was in training with a man whose parents had come to California as Italian immigrants, and he had very, very strong family ties, and I was quite close to him.
Okay. Were there any guys in particular that you hung out with, this gentleman being one, or was it more of a thinking of as a whole group?
I would say as a whole group. It was a very intensive period of training. We didn't have much time to be off the base. The war was turning in the favor of the Allies, but there was still a lot of war ahead.
You know, that's an interesting point. How did you get your news during that period of time?
Well, we had radio. We had a lot of news from home. I had letters from a girlfriend that was quite regular, and even home newspapers that were mailed to me.
That brings up another point. You met a young lady when you were in high school, right? Wasn't it high school?
No, she was in high school yet. I was out of high school, and
okay.
We were actually engaged just a week or two before I left for the Air Corps.
Wow. Well, she comes up a little later on in the story, so we'll just leave it from there. I guess I've talked to a lot of pilots in my time, and there's a real sense of exhilaration when you find that you've made the cut, so to speak. You've gone through these different elements of training. At any given time, you could get washed out. Is that correct?
That's true, and very often it would mean going from pilot training to being a navigator or a bombardier, possibly moving up to a co-pilot's place in a bomber. Mm-hmm. But I would guess that, thinking back, that probably a third to a half were transferred from one program to another, partly because of qualifications and sometimes just because of persons changing their focus on what they wanted to do.
Right. So you make it through.
I made it through and was very glad to graduate from Williams Air Force Base at Chandler, Arizona on December 10th of 1943.
Okay. That had to be one great day.
It was.
Did you throw your hats in the air or anything like that?
I'm sure we did. I'm sure we did, but the interesting thing was that all of us were given a 10-day delayed en route. So I went home for about 7 days. First leave that I'd had in over a year, about a year, and that was very exciting.
I guess proud as a peacock might come to mind. You're strutting around your girlfriend and your parents. You've made it as a pilot. That's wonderful. That's great. So after that, where did you go from there? What was the next step in your movement?
I returned out to Santa Rosa, California for more training in combat type airplanes. They put us in some P-39s that were phasing out as regular combat planes, and they were using them as training planes. And I flew for about 6 weeks in P-39s, cross country and navigation, some high altitude, and a while later, for about 2 weeks, our squadron was allowed or encouraged to go to P-63s, which are a plane that was never used in combat by the United States, but other countries did use them. Mm-hmm. And it was a good experience.
Mm-hmm. I realize that you're very young at this time, and I asked this question of every vet that I talked to. Did you have any inkling of what you were going to get into?
Most of us expected, because of being on the West Coast, that we would be sent to the South Pacific. And in early May, we had orders to leave California and go cross-country to Newport News, where we boarded a Liberty ship to go to Algiers in North Africa. So we knew then we were on our way to the ETO.
Yeah. Now, You were a unit? I mean, this is the same guys that you trained with also got onto the troop ship that went over? Or?
They were a unit in the sense that they were all replacements to 2 or 3 different groups in Italy.
So you would be scattered when you got there?
We'd be scattered.
Okay, you're replacing ones that either got killed
yes,
or...
and I lost track of all but probably 4 or 5 of the men that I had actually trained with.
Okay. Including this Italian gentleman, I hope?
Yes, he was not only my friend, but he was a tent mate.
Okay.
In Foggia in Italy.
Oh, okay. Outstanding. So you arrive in Algiers. From Algiers, you're now sent to Italy.
Right.
And give us an idea of what that was like. I mean, what did you see when you arrived there?
Italy was, I would say, the part I was in was quite a lot like Michigan, but of course in the north there are a lot of mountains. The Army was still trying to take Rome when we were there. From our tents at night, we could hear bombardment and probably artillery from when they were trying to take Rome. So that was my initiation to being in a battle zone.
What were your first duties? What were you supposed to do?
First duty was a gravy train. 17 of us, all new pilots, with a major, flew to Casablanca and picked with old P-38s, battle-weary 38s, and we picked up brand new P-38s at Casablanca on the western African coast that had come in with transports. So we were 17 of us were in brand new P-38s that I recall the mechanic that checked me out, he said, well, you be careful of this plane because they cost the government $265,000.
That brings up a good point. Did you, at this time, keep that aircraft, or did you fly other ones as well during that period?
No, we flew those back to Foggia, and then they were checked out, getting battle ready. And I don't think that any of those were necessarily assigned, but once we were assigned to a plane, then that was our own plane. That was our plane to fly each time we went on a mission.
Did you get a chance to do nose art or any kind of things that...
I was not there long enough to get my plane,
right,
but
okay.
the name of the plane was the crew chief had put on there the name Kitty, and that was his girlfriend.
Ah, okay.
And he said anytime I wanted to either get a picture or some simile of my girlfriend, why, he'd change it.
So what was your actual duties in terms of you were escorting, I take it? What were you supposed to be doing?
Basically, our thrust was to fly escort missions for bombers who were going to Austria, to Hungary, to Slovakia. A few of them even went to other places in Poland and then went on to Russia, but I never went on a mission like that.
Give us an idea of what these escort missions were like. I mean, were you talking about how many aircraft that you were flying cover, how many bombers?
That varied from mission to mission.
Okay.
Some of them were probably no more than 20, 30, or 40 bombers and maybe half that many or nearly that many fighter planes as escort. But the one mission that I was most involved with, at least I struggled with in memory and remembering, that there were over 600 bombers on the day that I was shot down, over 200 fighter planes as escort. And this whole formation was attacked by over 200 German fighter planes.
Well, without trying to sound too stupid, you're flying along, out of the sky comes Germans. What are you supposed to do?
Well, the basic reason we were there was to protect the bombers, because the German planes were not so interested in the fighter planes. They were after the bombers because they were going to do the damage. And the American planes were to keep the fighter planes away from the bombers. It's rather simple.
What was your first, we won't go into the 15th flight, we'll go into the first 14, so to speak. What were some of the engagements you had?
Most of them were interesting and educational. I was still in a type of training because of being a new pilot. And one occasion I did fly on a mission to northern Italy to bomb a railroad tunnel. That was only one of my missions. One other mission, we went on a strafing mission to an airfield near Budapest. Damaged probably a dozen German fighter planes and did some damage to the airport.
So you never actually got into aerial combat in terms of
at that time, no.
Okay.
No.
All right.
I was in a couple other aerial dog fights, but never really any close combat in the 15 missions that I flew until this 15th mission.
Right. So it's the day of the 15th mission. Let's start from, you get up in the morning and...
Before daylight.
Before daylight. What is let's walk through the procedure, if you will.
The fighter plane base, the 82nd Fighter Group that I was in, was all by itself in a big airfield that the Germans had built. And we knew just from preliminary intelligence that the bombers were just going to leave, and we had to rendezvous with them shortly after daylight, or say 8 or 8:30 in the morning, and which meant the bombers, of course, were from other airfields, and we didn't know any of them, didn't see any of them until we rendezvoused, usually out over the Mediterranean.
Okay. Are you in radio contact with the bombers?
To my knowledge, no, but we were in radio contact with the flight leaders and the group leaders.
Okay.
We listened to them rather than talking with them.
Right, right, I understand. So you're flying along now in formation with the bombers.
In a sense, yes, but the bombers, of course, were considerably slower than the fighter planes.
Sure.
So they were on a steady course, and to maintain our position, we had to weave in a sort of a figure 8 over the bombers. After we got anywhere near would be combat zone. And we would weave back and forth, which was not only a means of keeping in step with the bombers, but it was also a way of being alert to where the German fighters might be.
Yeah, one of the Flying Tigers that I interviewed said that you had to have a rubber neck. You had to be looking around all the time.
Yes, that's a good description of what you were doing.
So let's go to that moment where the battle begins.
The bombers were just keep going. And first I heard on the radio was that there were boogies at about 11 o'clock, and they were moving toward the bombers. And the flight leader, who I was assigned to stay on his wing, went into combat mode. We dropped our belly tanks, turned the guns on, and for, I'm guessing 3 or 4 minutes, I didn't see a German plane. But after just 2 or 3 minutes, here was a group of 4 to 6 German Me-410s, and they separated just my flight leader and myself from the rest of the flight. I was obliged to follow the flight leader, and I assumed that he had time to at least engage the German plane, but I didn't. And with outnumbered at least 4 to 2, I found myself all by myself, and within less than a minute, Me-410 coming from underneath set my oxygen and hydraulic system on fire.
What happened next?
P-38 is hard to get out of in flight, especially when you're going 300 or 350 miles an hour. But in training, we were taught that you roll it over and bail out. You could not bail out safely because of the horizontal stabilizer that was there to hit you. So I rolled the plane at least part way over, but I was in the cockpit that had quite a lot of flame in it. I was being burned, and I could not see very well, but I rolled it over at least pretty well upside down and bailed out.
I've actually interviewed one other man who was in a burning cockpit. And he said at that moment he thought he was going to die. Was there any sense of...
I don't think so. I think that the survival to live was such that I knew I had to get out, and I bailed out, but I was going way too fast. I would guess that I was going at least 300 miles an hour, which is too fast to bail out of a plane that didn't have an ejection seat. So, but I did bail out. And I remember stating or expressing myself in this, "Lord, help me." And the second expression was that I can remember was, "Judy, I'll be all right." And that was a nickname that I had used for my girlfriend for a long time. And within a minute, I had passed out. I knew I was in a parachute. I could hear combat around me, but I passed out from the burns and broken back that somehow I obtained getting out of the plane.
Did you have any idea where you were in terms of the territory below you?
I assumed that we were over Austria because we had been told that that's where the bombers were going. But I actually was 40 to 50 miles east of there, over a little country called Slovakia that was part of the Czechoslovak Republic.
So the cockpit is burning. You flip the airplane over. You're struggling to get out. Somehow you get out. You pass out, but your parachute apparently opened.
Parachute opened, and I knew it was open.
Okay. And what happened next?
I was probably 6,000 to 8,000 feet in the air, unconscious, and I remember nothing except hearing someone on the ground saying the word morphine. What I didn't know at the time, of course, until several days later, that I had landed on a house in a little town called Pezinok in Slovakia, a block and a half from a fire station where they had some emergency equipment. They put me on a stretcher, bandaged up the burns, put me on an ambulance, and took me to the capital of Slovakia, which is a city by the name of Bratislava.
You showed me a picture, a remarkable picture that many, many years later, you open up your mail and there's a picture of you lying on that cot, completely unconscious, looking actually dead to the world. So I've actually seen what you went through, but at some moment you woke up. What happened?
I woke up, became conscious in a hospital called a Slovak National Hospital in the capital, in a bed, miserable, and a nurse was talking to me in English, which amazed me. And later I found out that she was a Catholic nun who had been in a Slovak hospital in South Dakota for 7 years before World War II started. In 1937, she went back to her home country for a visit. And in 1938, when Germany began occupying Eastern Europe, she was not allowed to return. She had intended to. So for that first 18 to 24 hours, I had a personal nurse who could speak English, and every other conversation that I was listening to was totally strange to me.
Yeah, let's go back for a moment. Before you heard her speak English, when you actually woke up, you heard foreign language around you. Yeah. Where did you think you were?
I thought I was in Austria. I thought I was in, I just assumed in that state that I was in that it was German, but it didn't sound at all familiar.
Okay. Were you in pain?
Very much, yes. Yeah. Had some rather severe burns, and I had what they told me was a compression fracture of 3 vertebrae in my low back. And later I found out that I had a rather severe muscle hernia that was repaired after I returned home.
I guess, did you must have tried to reconstruct what actually happened. I mean, the parachute and you fell through the roof of a house.
Well, I landed on a slate roof of a house. Okay. And slid off the roof into what's called a courtyard over there. And I remember none of that.
Well, yeah.
And these actually firemen put me on a cot, took me that block and a half to the fire station, and gave me medical aid until we got to the hospital.
So it might be safe to say that if you weren't unconscious, you might have been killed. I mean, everything was so relaxed, I guess, that when you hit there and rolled over.
I think so, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, amazing. So now you're in the hospital. You're behind enemy lines, is that correct?
Behind enemy lines, but it was the Slovak army was in control of Slovakia. What most people, or many people, do not remember, that Slovakia was a neutral country, designated that by the Germans to show the eastern part of Europe that they were like Switzerland and Sweden, I assume. Mm-hmm. That was on June 26th of 44. And late in August of 44, the Germans decided, because of all the reverses they were having on the Eastern Front and in Europe and in northern Italy, that they had to take over in Slovakia. There was also a Slovak partisan uprising at that same time in the central part, or the mountainous part of Slovakia.
This is a partisan against the Germans?
Definitely against the Germans, okay. And with some aid from the United States, but more from the Russians, because they were close by.
So here you are in Slovakia. You're still, although you may not think so, relatively safe because you're within the confines of the control of the Slovakian army. But now the Germans come in.
Yes.
So tell us what happened at that point.
I don't know all the details because of language and because of the fear and the secrecy that so many people had, because they were in between the Russians who were approaching and the Germans who were retreating, not in the immediate area. Mm-hmm. But late in August of 1944, the Slovak partisans began an uprising against the Germans, and they literally massacred or killed quite a few German soldiers and some German officers in that period. So Germany, late in August, moved in. I've heard various reports of 300 to 500,000 men, some from the Eastern Front, some from Italy, and some from Germany. And they took over the country in late August of 1944. There was a big pocket of resistance in the mountain areas in Slovakia that was just favoring this uprising.
How did that affect you?
The Slovak Red Cross, up until this time, I was a prisoner of war of the Slovak army. Mm-hmm. When the Germans occupied the country, the Slovak Red Cross decided to protect me rather than turn me over to the Germans. I was still in a hospital, so they moved me from the hospital in Bratislava to a small country hospital at Skalica, which was approximately 100 miles north of where I had been. But 2 months later, with the Germans in control, they requisitioned the whole hospital that I was in Skalica, and the Slovak Red Cross put me in an ambulance again and took me back to the original hospital, hoping to find a place that they could hide me or something, because they were in favor, they were partial to the Americans and to the British, and they didn't want to turn me over to the Germans.
Which is a very dangerous thing to do.
It put me in a very precarious situation, because up till for that 2 months period, I'd been identified as a civilian in a hospital. I had no uniform. The only thing I had to show that I was an American serviceman was I had dog tags.
Which you kept hidden, I take it.
Which I kept, yes.
Yeah. Who were the other patients in that hospital?
There were, in both hospitals that I was in, there were German soldiers who had been injured just recently until they could be transferred back to Austria or Germany. There were Slovak army personnel that had been injured. One I remember vividly was a young man by the name of Vasil, who, in the original part of this experience, knew that I was not German, and he didn't have any idea that I was an American. But he knew that I'd been in the war, and he had been in the war and had lost his whole lower jaw, and they were reconstructing in this hospital so that he would have a jaw and some lips.
I guess the thing that strikes me is that if I was laying in that hospital bed and there were Germans in there, if somebody walked up and asked me for a cigarette or something in German, did you ever think that this sort of thing might happen, or were you afraid?
I was very concerned about it. And as they took me back to the original hospital, the Slovak Red Cross said, "We want you to be isolated other than someone will bring you some meals, and your bathroom facilities are across the hall," because in that room there was nothing but a little lavatory. So I was very careful when I needed to use the bathroom to see that there were not Germans or someone that was a stranger in the hallway.
Boy, it's hard to even imagine the day-to-day, minute-to-minute, moment-to-moment living, and plus you're still in pain, I take it.
Well, by that time, this would have been in December and actually January of 1945, and I was very ambulatory, wearing civilian clothes, hoping that somehow there would be a resolution either to the war or to my circumstance so I could get out from where I was being, in a sense, held.
Yeah. You know, another interesting point is that while you were in training and even when you were going into battle, you had letters from home, you had some news of the outside. Did you have any idea what was going on outside of your immediate hospital area in terms of the war and what was going on?
Yes, because there were several occasions where someone that was never named but would say, "Would you like to listen to BBC tonight?" And would go to a different room at the invitation of a hospital staff, but the patient that they knew who was in that room would have a radio, and in the evening or rather late in the evening we could, a few times I listened to BBC telling about what was going on, and that was quite different from what the newspapers there, or that I was told about the newspapers or told about the news that was of course German control.
That had to be a great feeling to actually listen to an English voice and know that they're winning. And
yes, it was great, and I think on the same level or even better was that on occasion I was given an English New Testament. I was given 4 or 5 National Geographics in English, and they were read more than once, of course.
Yeah. Once again, that was dangerous, though. I mean, if somebody saw you reading in English, I would think that there would be some danger involved in that.
Well, not necessarily, because a lot of people there at that period in their time were studying English, and there were a considerable number of people, younger people in particular, who had learned English in school, and it was the rare occasion that I would hear English, but English was, they were interested more in English than they were in Russian or German.
Who did you speak to, or did you speak to very many people at all?
Early on, there were hospital individuals who, of course, gave me food and changed my dressings, and actually gave me a form of physical therapy for my leg. But after that, it was pretty lonely. Most people in the hospital, I think almost universally, they would not have known that I was anything but just a patient in the hospital.
Well, you know, something that surprises me is that if they thought that you were Slovak, then how come they weren't talking to you in that language?
Well, I was basically isolated. The last period of time from in November, I was told to stay in the room. I was told not to talk to anybody. There were times when I considered, well, I'm mute, so I'll ignore what people are saying.
Yeah, it's smart. So in March of '45, I understand partisans arrived at the hospital. Is that about?
Yes, and this was all arranged by someone unknown or a group unknown. On a Tuesday morning, a lady speaking good English came to the door, the hospital, and said, "Could you leave Thursday morning?" And thought for a moment, yes, I would be glad to leave if it's an improvement. And she told me, she said, well, Thursday morning there'll be 2 men come here to the hospital and we'll have information or papers that will let you be discharged from the hospital. I have no idea how that was obtained. Even to when they arrived, they handed me papers that had my picture. I don't know how they obtained the picture. They took it when I didn't know about it. In actually just civilian clothes, not hospital garb, and handed me a very small suitcase with some other clothes in and motioned for me to come. They didn't speak English, and of course I didn't speak their language, except I had learned a lot of words, but the grammar would have been non-existent.
So where did they take you?
They drove to an area just at the east part of Bratislava. They stopped in actually it was a restaurant, and went in. They said, moment, and meaning they'd be back shortly. And so I'm guessing now that it was maybe half an hour later. They came back, and we started for parts that I didn't have any idea where I was going. And at the guard post at the edge of town, or the edge of the city, was a German inspection place where they stopped people coming into the city or leaving the city. You had to have papers to travel, and there wasn't much travel because of fuel limitations and military, and the war was going against the Germans. So the man that was driving showed the guard the papers, and he waved us through.
That had to be a very scary moment.
Well, it wasn't the worst. Because 50 or more yards down the road, there were 2 German soldiers hitchhiking. And the driver, and I assume it was in French, said to the other person in the front seat something that indicated, well, we need to pick them up. Because there was so little traffic, and actually a car with room in it was expected to pick up German soldiers who were hitchhiking. So 2 German soldiers got in the back seat with me, one on each side of me, no less, and I pretended that I was half asleep or at least very sleepy. And one of them tried to start a conversation, and in German, of course, and after about the second try, he says, "Ne sprechen Sie Deutsch?" which is probably a poor transliteration of German, but he understood it, and that was the last conversation they tried to make.
Wasn't there something about 2 bottles or something?
There were 2 empty wine bottles on the floor, and I just assumed that they thought, as I looked at them, that maybe I'd imbibed a little of that wine.
You see scenes like that in World War II movies, and the tension is there watching the movie. I can't imagine what it's like to actually be stuck between these 2 Germans.
Well, the length of time I was in the hospital, I think that I had practiced this and some brushes with circumstances that were hard to define. I think I appeared rather calm, and I prayed, and I pretended that I was asleep, or at least very sleepy. And 20 to 30 miles out of the city, they tapped the driver on the seat. They wanted to get out, and they went their way. Incidentally, they each had a rifle slung over their shoulders that was right in the back seat with me.
Wow. So they get out. There's this huge sigh of relief, maybe.
Yes.
At least a silent one.
Yeah.
Where did you go from there?
They took me through a city, small city by the name of Topolchany, that just drove through the city and drove through a couple other small towns. It was getting to late in the afternoon by that time. They took me to a house in a little town by the name of Zavada, and I learned that later. And they just very informally turned me over to an older man in a home at the edge of this little town of perhaps a couple dozen homes. And he invited me in and gave me a snack that evening and showed me where I could sleep upstairs. And the next morning he said, "Come on," or "Kommen Sie." Now that's German, but it was the Slovak equivalent of "come on," and handed me a little sandwich and a paper, and I had this little suitcase, and we walked for something like 3 miles up a 2-track, and came to a little settlement, not even a settlement, there was a house and a chicken coop and a barn in the mountains, right in the woods, that I still think was probably a rather medium-priced hunting lodge before the war, and introduced me to a man and his wife who were middle-aged, and they would take care of me.
You know what amazes me, Al, is that number one, how obviously organized this underground was, and that these people are willing to risk their lives like this.
I have a book at home that is a lot of detail about the partisan activity, and it was amazing, the network that they had, and even after the Germans were in control in Slovakia, how well it worked in a lot of circumstances. On other circumstances, it became very fatal to some people who worked with or served as helpers or as partisans. When I arrived at this location called Zlavi, which very few people in Slovakia know the location of where Zlavi is, there were 3 other individuals there, a Jewish doctor and his son who were hiding from the Germans, and a Slovak banker who had run into financial problems with the Germans, and so he just was hiding. And I was there from the first part of March until about the middle or later part of April with those 3 other individuals and the couple who actually owned or at least were there in charge and were actually helping us and feeding us. And incidentally, there were 2 Jewish families living in bunkers from September the prior year in the woods 1 to 2 miles away from this home, that this couple were taking care of 1 hot meal a day from September until April of 1945.
Were you able to communicate with these people while you were there?
Never communicated audibly at all, but I had met them or seen them in the woods, because in the daytime, late in March and into April, it was nice spring weather there. And this doctor's son and myself he was somewhat younger, but we walked in the woods. I kept trying to get more strength back and trying to be active and in anticipation of getting out of there.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned spring weather. What was the weather like in Slovakia during the period you were there?
In the wintertime, there was some snow, and in the mountains, this was the lower elevation of one of the mountains there, north of the capital. But in the city, a lot less snow than we would have, at least that winter. Mm-hmm. It was a milder winter, and when I first was there in early March, in the mountains, there were patches of snow, but shortly it was gone, and from then on it was like we would have in April here.
Mm-hmm. So you were never really in weather conditions that were threatening to you?
No, not for myself.
Okay.
A month or 2 earlier must have been a lot worse when there was snow on the ground, and incidentally, the Jewish families were fed, as I mentioned, once a meal each day, and of course they would save part of that meal for another meal. Mm-hmm. The individual who would take them meals when there was snow on the ground would take a broom, and after they had delivered their food, they would brush out in the snow their footprints, just because it was one of those things that someone or some low-flying aircraft would identify, well, there's somebody in the woods.
It's hard to believe, you know, today that these kinds of things happen, that the people would have to wait out in the woods and wait for somebody else's compassion to bring out a meal and risk their lives like that. It's just...
Well, that shows the compassion that the Slovak people had. They treated these 2 Jewish families as well as they could. For myself, there were the examples you've heard, and many others, that they were just kind. They were generous. They shared what they had, whether it was in the hospital or whether it was up at this partisan camp. I had the same food that they had, and I was very thankful for it.
Yeah. So right around this time, the Russians start to come into the picture.
In early April, they had some radio, and they'd even listen there at this home to British Broadcasting on occasion. And early April, they knew and I knew then that the Russians were moving into the eastern part of Slovakia. And about the middle of April, the Russians took this town of Topolchany and a large German barracks. It had been a Slovak barracks and then a German barracks, and now the Russians were in this barracks. So after the middle of April, I went with some help, actually, a horse and buggy part of the way, down to this Russian barracks and told the Russians who I was, showed him my dog tags, and through some Slovak words that I knew and some English words that he knew, and of course the officers there had some knowledge of English. I told them that who I was and what do I do? And they said, well, Bratislava, the capital, is still in the hands of the Germans, and you can either stay here for another week or two, or you can go back to Slavy. Well, I elected to go back to Slavy because I felt comfortable there and I'd been treated well.
Was there any evidence of the battle that the Russians and the Germans had been through when you arrived there?
In the immediate area, no, not even Topolchany, because in many of the locations, these were valleys, small or narrow areas in the country, and the Germans had to retreat. And I don't recall any damage in Topolchany. But other places, and traveling with in a Russian truck from there to the capital, there was evidence of railroads being damaged or buildings burned or destroyed.
So you go back to the comfort, if you will, of your original place.
Yes,
how long did you stay there?
For about another 10 days. And then the folks at the camp there said, well, Bratislava has been taken by the Russians. So then I went back to the barracks in Topolchany, and they put me on a Russian truck, took me into the capital. Same city, but to a hotel that had been taken over by the Russians. And walked into a room with a Russian individual who was showing me around, and here were 4 Americans. 4 evaders that had been shot down out of bombers the fall and winter while I was there, either in the hospitals or in this partisan camp. And needless to say, we became friends immediately, and we traveled then from there to Budapest in late April. The 5 of us were in Budapest in the day Germany surrendered on the 7th of May.
Now, these other Americans, they were all Army Air Corps as well?
They were Air Corps, gunners, radio operators, I think all but one. And one, as I recall, I think was an engineer.
Were they from what parts of the country, do you remember?
Joplin, Missouri, and Hickman, Kentucky, and Wisconsin, and myself was from Michigan.
That must have been, I mean, that moment of seeing those guys and they're looking at you, your faces must have revealed that you guys were pretty happy to see each other.
A few times in my life have I ever been more excited about meeting someone that I could speak with and understand and share with.
Yeah. And they were all about your age, right?
They were, I think each one was, I know each one was a little younger than myself. By that time, I was 24 years old. And they were in their early 20s, and they were enlisted men, and I was a second lieutenant. So automatically, according to Air Force protocol, I was in charge.
Oh, okay.
And they didn't call me lieutenant. They called me the old man. But didn't bother me a bit.
Right. It was a term of respect and endearment. But yeah, 24 years old, oh, you're an old man to a 22-year-old, sure.
Sometimes I felt quite old.
How were your injuries by this time?
I was walking well. There were times I was very uncomfortable. I had a lot of backache. I was limping, and limping because of the problems with one leg, that because of nerves and that injury. But I'd improved a lot in 9 or 10 months.
What about the burns?
Very obvious, but they were all healed. The care that they gave me in the hospital was was excellent as far as I was concerned. Side issue to that is that I've talked to a man who was burned much worse than I was, who was repatriated out of Hungary, and he was burned, his face and his arms, and he was burned quite badly. They wrapped him in lard and covered the lard with newspapers until it started to heal. Well, that's what he told me.
What did they put on you?
It was a Vaseline type thing, but I was only burned over part of my face, my ears, the back of my neck, my wrists where the skin was exposed, but actually the uniform and the clothing underneath the uniform did not burn very much. I did see in the hospitals, someone showed me part of the flight uniform, and it was very scorched, but it was still pretty much whole.
Because I know that during World War II there was a purple salve that was used, but the Americans had that.
I didn't see anything purple.
Okay.
I don't recall that.
Okay, all right. So once you were you left Budapest, I understand then you went to the American military mission.
No, we were at the American military mission in Budapest.
Let's talk about that, because I'm not sure people would know what a military mission means.
Well, my understanding then, and I think this is accurate, that each time the United States or these other countries would liberate a country, they would soon set up what was called an American military mission. And that was a forerunner of probably what later would be an American embassy. But the war was still on. And this mission had taken over a hotel, and that was the point where POWs, ex-POWs, and sometimes civilians who had gotten caught or were in prisoner of war camps or detainees that wanted to get home. And this was a formal organization that was operating in Budapest, because Budapest had been taken over by actually the Russians before the war was over. And Bratislava, of course, was still under German control.
At this point, I would imagine you're feeling like it's almost over with. I'm heading home.
We expected to go back right to Italy and then go home. But a agreement that President Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin had made at Yalta the summer or the fall before stated that all prisoners of war or people who need to be repatriated home had to be repatriated through the country that liberated them. So we found out that we didn't go back directly to Italy, but we were put on the 5 of us were put on a Russian troop train with 52 German ex-POWs, 52 English ex-POWs that had been liberated, and the Russians sent us clear to Odessa in the Ukraine.
Did you have a chance to talk to any of these British guys?
Oh, definitely, yes. Not really. It wasn't really conducive to a lot of conversation on a troop train that had just wooden benches, and we were pretty much by ourselves. But we did. We talked with them, visited with them, and a wide range of experiences. Some of them have been military. Most of them had been military, but involved with her were just some people who had been interned by Germany or the country they were in because there was a war.
Was there a sense of all of you that there's like a relief that it's finally over with? I mean, was there any kind of a
Yes, and it was almost an adventure to be going into places that you probably never see again. We went through Romania and we went through Bessarabia and into the Ukraine, and always have liked to travel, and so that fit right into, as long as I had to be there, well, let's enjoy it.
Well, you know, it's interesting because at this point you're not really in any kind of danger, so why not take advantage of being a tourist?
Yeah. Well, we wondered when we got to Odessa, just where we were, because we'd heard stories about Russians detaining ex-POWs because their story or the evidence was perhaps not clear at all. And the Russians actually, for 4 days, interrogated us, almost like I was interrogated as a POW, and you know, here you've got, what do you got to show other than the uniform you're wearing and the dog tags as to you are who you say you are? And it was not anything real hurtful, or, you know, but it was in a sense necessary. And for 4 days they kept asking us questions, and finally then they got orders that the 5 of us, and I think all, or at least most of those British subjects, were put on the British troop transport by the name of Arawa. And it took almost a day to get loaded the ship with a lot of people like myself, and then we left the harbor there in Odessa and headed back to Naples.
So this troop ship was about how many people are you talking about?
I would just
guess,
from memory, I would guess 200.
Okay.
Plus a crew.
Sure.
And
these are people that were POWs, or?
Most of them are ex-POWs or evaders, and it's amazing how many evaders there were.
Yeah, explain, I mean, we've talked about that. What is an evader?
The 4 men that I met in Bratislava were, had bailed out of, I think, 3 different aeroplanes, and somehow had collected in an area in the mountains north of where I was at Zlavi, and not partisans in their case, but just individuals in a real small rural town would take them in, feed them, and the Germans just left that type of population pretty much alone. They lived as civilian people, kept out of sight.
So in other words, they just evaded. They were not prisoners of war.
These 4 men were never prisoners of war. They were evaders, and I have kept in contact with 2 of them, and it's been very interesting over the years.
That's amazing. So actually, you were categorized as an evader as well, wouldn't you say?
The first 2 months, I was identified as a Slovak prisoner of war.
Oh, that's right.
And as far as their records, and as far as the German, any records, the Germans probably had no records about myself. Mm-hmm. But from then on, I was an evader because almost no one knew who I was or where I was.
You know, this is something I missed. I apologize for this, but when you were first captured, or you say you're a prisoner of war of the Slovaks, what did your family know? What did your girlfriend know about what happened to you?
1 week after I was in the hospital, the American Red Cross in Switzerland, somehow through records or through information, notified my wife, or my girlfriend. Excuse me, no, I'm sorry, because we were actually married when I was out in California.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
So it was my wife at that time, and she was notified that I was a prisoner of war of the Slovak Army in a hospital, injured, which can mean a broken hand to a broken back.
Yeah.
And 1 week later, I'm sorry, 1 week later, after the first announcement that I was missing in action, then she received the notice that I was a prisoner of war of the Slovak Army in a hospital.
And after that, did they have any communication with the Red Cross or any other as to what the status of your condition was?
It was another one of those unusual, and I've never heard that from anyone else, but an international Slovak representative visited me in the hospital in the early part of the time that I was a prisoner of the Slovak Army. And learning that in my background, my mother, or rather my grandmother and my mother had come from Switzerland. So it was a point of interest, and he was interested and asked me where, and I said, well, it was from Bulledingen, Herzogenbuchsee. And he didn't know where that was, except that he knew it was in the northern part, and I said, well, that's not too far from Bern. But anyway, he said to me, if you would like to send a note to your family or to your wife, he says, I will see that it gets mailed. So my wife received either 2 or 3 letters from me, which were very carefully written, and I didn't say much, but he would pick them up, and they were mailed from Switzerland. My wife received these letters, and she couldn't figure it out because I didn't say very much, but it was my handwriting, and they weren't censored. She had 2 friends in the hospital that had boyfriends or husbands that were in the same circumstance or different areas but same circumstance, every note or every letter was censored. So that was a puzzle until I got home.
So now you're on this is June. Something really remarkable happened. You've come back to the
Italy.
States, to Italy rather.
Yes, right,
to Italy.
Naples.
Right, to Naples.
And from Naples, the ex-POWs, men who had been injured, special cases were put on a converted B-17, and we were flown to Casablanca, to Belém in Brazil, and then up the coast up to Miami. Arrived in Miami on the first day of July, 1945.
Well, let's talk about the reunion, though. You had a reunion with your old outfit. Was that?
Well, that goes back to Italy.
Okay.
That goes back to Italy. When the ship landed at Naples, and the Termi Hotel in Naples was almost crowded with POWs, injured servicemen, people wanting to go home. And it'd be at least a week, maybe more, before you get out of here. So I traveled back, or hitchhiked back to both Barry, where I was originally classified, or rather sent into, assigned to a group.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went back to my old outfit at Foggia. And the intelligence officer, who I remembered, Captain Christensen, was there, and I walked in and told him my name, and he says, "You're supposed to be dead." The Air Force records were not perfect at that time, and the flight leader that was also shot down, same time I was, his plane crashed into a swamp something like 2 to 3 miles from where my plane crashed. And there was a misinterpretation of radio records that I was the one that was missing, presumed dead, and that Ray Allen was a prisoner of war, or at least missing in action, and they didn't know. And that was soon resolved. And then I found out that this lieutenant that was of Italian background had flown 45 missions and then was killed in a friendly fire accident near the home base later in the war than when I was shot down.
So that moment when you walk in the room with your old outfit, I realize you say you didn't know a lot of the guys, but still, that had to be a great moment.
It was second or third best to getting home.
That's a good way of putting it. So out of Casablanca, into Brazil, into Miami, and I understand you had some leave coming to you.
Well, I had, yes, as a ex-POW. After I got to Fort Sheridan, orders were that I had 60 days leave. And that was a reunion that I'll never forget with my wife and my family.
You returned back. Let's try and capture that moment. Where did you see them?
Well, actually, I had telephoned ahead, and my wife said she would come to Chicago and meet me, and that actually met me at a train station right near Fort Sheridan. And transportation was not as well. Maybe it was almost as good as it is today, but the next day, actually, we traveled by train back to Grand Rapids, which was her hometown, and to Lowell, which was my hometown, and began that 60-day leave.
You walk into a room, and there's Mom and Dad. What was that like?
Well, that was super, but it was better to meet my wife in Chicago.
Were your injuries still evident when you met with the family?
Yes, I got around fine, and actually a friend from a work opportunity that I'd had before I was in the service knew I was home, and he called and he says, "We've got a cottage up at Bill's Lake up by Newaygo. He says, why don't you spend a week up there?" So early in that 60 days, we went to Bill's Lake, and that was my first vacation in, a year and a half at least, or almost 2 years.
Yeah, that is just wonderful. Coming back home, to Grand Rapids, to Lowell, was there any recognition of the vets, or of you in particular, of your neighbors and people around you?
Yes. Remembering that many of them who were in the service in World War II were not arriving home as early as I did because of my circumstances. But what impressed me more at the time, and I still remember that the newspapers that my folks had saved, at least 3 of the men I had graduated from high school with had lost their lives in World War II. Others had been injured, some of them more serious than myself, and that detracted a little from the excitement of coming home, but I remember that distinctly, and I still have newspapers about that.
Yeah. Once the 60 days were over with, what happened from there?
I had orders to go to Atlantic City, New Jersey for a reclassification because I was still in the Air Force.
What's reclassification mean?
Well, it means that they determine whether you want to get out, because although I should mention that in August of just before I went to Atlantic City, Japan surrendered. So of course that changed the picture. Men who were coming back from the ETO were the need was not as great. So reclassification meant for me that I probably could choose between getting out of the military or attempting to stay in. When they first started my physical in Atlantic City, an officer said, "Well, you'll never fly again because of injuries and what has happened." And so I had no really intention of trying to stay in anyway, so the next move was that they sent me to a hospital in Plattsburgh, New York, for evaluation of what had happened and what they would do.
And so are you laying in bed?
No,
You're around. Okay.
No. That 60 days was, well, out of that 60 days, they let me go home for 30 days for another leave because they were so busy with men who needed help in that hospital.
Yeah.
And actually there, they only checked my eyes. They did some minor work with my eyes because my eyes had been burned and tear ducts were a problem.
What were your options as you were thinking about it then? What were your options?
This classification officer said that, he says, if you want to stay in, we probably could find a place. But if you want to get out, why, then we just soon you would, because we don't need you. That was not that plain, but that was what the circumstances were.
Well, in terms of what you're thinking about, that's your options within the military. But what were you thinking in terms? I mean, you got a wife. You're going back home. What were your options?
I didn't have any intention of staying in. Had I not been injured, I probably would have considered and probably would have liked to have stayed in the Air Force, because at that point in time, there was still a lot of tension with Japan. There was the things that were going on in Europe that most people didn't know about with Russia's intentions. And I know men that stayed in. I know one friend that actually became a captain and then a major and got into B-29s in the South Pacific even after the war.
So what did you do? You were discharged. I
decided that because of circumstances, I would go home and probably go back to actually just secular employment. I had worked as in a hardware store. I'd worked in an industrial supply. Actually, one time, for a short time when I was in Detroit, I worked as a necktie salesman at Hudson department store in Detroit. So, but my interest at that point in time was I'd like to live either in a small town or in the country and possibly have a farm.
So what'd you end up doing?
Well, within a year after I was actually discharged, I bought a small farm and still intended to work at employment and just have that as a hobby. But there was a GI Bill that made available to veterans like myself up to 4 years of training in a college or in a technical school. And they also had a program that farmers could, if they had no experience or little experience, they could take 4 years with Michigan State University, which is an ag school, giving instruction, either 1 or 2 afternoons a week. And I elected to do that.
So you also brought up a family.
Brought up a family. We had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. I also have 10 grandchildren.
Oh my goodness.
And now at this point in my life, we have 5 great-grandchildren.
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm very, very pleased to hear that after all what you went through, you know, that you were able to come back and be able to start a family like that.
I feel very thankful. I feel blessed. I feel that my faith and my confidence in what I believe in the Bible is a big part of what helped me, and it helped me to be stable and at least come back the way I have. And I have a friend who has made this statement about myself, that actually his circumstances were quite similar to mine. And he has said, well, he said, Providence sure shined on you.
Yeah. Al, one other question, and we'll wrap this up, but you went through a lot of danger. You went through actual moments and weeks and months in which at any time something could have changed everything. Somebody could have walked up to you and found out that you were an American. You could have been put into a POW camp. With all those experiences, all that horrific experience of being shot down, what did your World War II experience teach you, if you will? What did you get from all that to become the person you are today?
And a short answer to that would be, I think that in 1 to 2 years of training, and then the short amount of combat experience that I had, that I grew up from perhaps an immature adult. I'd like to think of it as a little more, a little better term than that, but to an adult who had experienced what not very many people experience. The generosity, the compassion, the things that the Slovak people did for me go way above and beyond the call of duty. They hid me, they fed me, they treated me royally, almost that, with the exception that they had to be more careful, or at least as careful as I was trying to be. And I am grateful to individuals, many of whom I have no idea what their name was even. But in that partisan camp at Zlavy and on other occasions, they risked their lives. And it wasn't just for myself. It was for these other 4 evaders that I became acquainted with. It was with many that I have read about. Some I've talked to personally. And I have yet to find or meet anyone that has had experiences similar to mine that have any criticism or anything harsh to say about the Slovak people. I am grateful to them for things that they did that I didn't even deserve, or at least I obtained the benefit and I didn't really earn it.
Well, I personally think you earned it, but that's perhaps not for me to say. I just want to say that I am personally grateful to you, to the generation of my father, that you did go through these, because we would not have the freedoms that we have today if you hadn't gone through the sacrifices that you went through. And I realize that your generation is very modest about that, and you say, oh, I was just one guy like everybody else. And in a sense, that's true, but my executive director often says I've got one of the greatest jobs in the world, and one of the reasons is because I get a chance to meet people like you. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.